What happens when Hollywood's most enigmatic star walks into daytime television's hottest seat and refuses to play by the rules? The View's studio fell into absolute chaos when John Travolta arrived for what was supposed to be a lighthearted promotional appearance, but instead turned into one of the most jaw-dropping confrontations in daytime TV history. Before we get into what actually went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us which side you're on. Because trust me, you're going to have an opinion about this one. The morning started like any other taping at The View. The audience filed in, the cameras got into position, and the producers ran through the usual pre-show checks. John Travolta was scheduled to appear in the second segment to discuss his latest film project, a passion piece he'd been trying to get made for nearly a decade. The talk around the studio was that this would be an easy interview, a feel-good segment about cinema, craft, and comeback stories. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, expected what was about to unfold. Joy Behar opened the segment with her trademark style, all smiles and quick wit, as she introduced the Hollywood legend to thunderous applause. Travolta walked out in a crisp navy suit, waving to the crowd with that unmistakable charisma he's carried since his Saturday Night Fever days. He settled into the guest chair, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. They exchanged pleasantries, Joy cracked a joke about dancing, and the audience ate it up. But you could see something in Travolta's expression, a slight tension around his eyes, a guardedness that wasn't quite matching his smile. Joy dove into questions about the new film, and Travolta answered enthusiastically, talking about the script, the director, the emotional journey of bringing this story to life. His passion was evident as he described the character, a man grappling with questions of faith and identity in modern America. That's when Joy leaned forward and asked the question that would ignite everything. She wanted to know if the character's struggles with organized religion reflected Travolta's own complicated relationship with his beliefs, a thinly veiled reference to the controversies that had followed him for years. The studio got noticeably quieter. Travolta's smile didn't fade, but it changed, becoming something harder, more calculating. He said that his personal beliefs were his own, and that the character's journey was universal, something anyone could relate to regardless of their background. It was a diplomatic answer, the kind celebrities give all the time when they want to sidestep landmines, but Joy wasn't letting it go. She pressed further, mentioning specific allegations and controversies by name, suggesting that his involvement in certain organizations had affected his career choices and personal life in ways the public deserved to understand. Travolta's jaw tightened. He said he'd come to talk about his film, not to be interrogated about his private life on national television. The energy in the room shifted completely. The other hosts exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether to jump in or let Joy continue. The audience sat frozen, sensing they were witnessing something that had gone off script. Joy responded that when public figures accept money and fame from the public, they open themselves to questions about how their associations influence their work and their platform. That's when Travolta did something unexpected. Instead of shutting down or walking back his position, he turned the tables. He looked directly at Joy and asked her if she'd be comfortable being interrogated about every personal decision she'd ever made, every friendship she'd maintained, every belief she'd held that others found controversial. He pointed out that she'd built a career on speaking her mind freely, often defending people's right to believe what they wanted without persecution, yet here she was, doing exactly what she'd condemned others for doing. The audience actually gasped. You could hear it ripple through the studio. Joy's expression hardened immediately. She shot back that there's a difference between defending free speech and enabling organizations that allegedly harm people. She said that journalists have a responsibility to ask difficult questions, especially when someone uses their platform to potentially influence vulnerable people. Travolta countered that he'd never used his platform to recruit anyone or push any agenda, that his work spoke for itself, and that what Joy was doing wasn't journalism, it was a personal attack disguised as advocacy. Sonny Hostin tried to interject, suggesting they could all take a breath and refocus on the film, but Joy wasn't having it. She said this was exactly the kind of conversation that needed to happen, that too many interviewers let celebrities slide on important issues because they're afraid of making things uncomfortable. Travolta laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. He said discomfort wasn't the issue. Dishonesty was. He accused Joy of bringing him on the show under false pretenses, promising a conversation about his art but actually planning an ambush about his personal life. Joy fired right back, her voice rising. She insisted that she'd never promised anything, that anyone coming on The View should know they might face tough questions, and that if he couldn't handle basic scrutiny, maybe he shouldn't be in the public eye at all. Travolta stood up from his chair. The audience went completely silent. He said he'd been in the public eye for almost 50 years and had faced every kind of scrutiny imaginable. But what he wouldn't do is sit there and be disrespected by someone using their platform to bully guests under the guise of holding them accountable. The word bully hung in the air like a bomb. Joy stood up too, which almost never happens during interviews. She said she'd been called many things in her career, but a bully wasn't one of them. And she wasn't about to start accepting that characterization from someone who couldn't answer straightforward questions about their choices. Travolta said the questions weren't straightforward. They were loaded, designed to make him look guilty no matter how he answered. He said, "That's not journalism, that's prosecution," and he hadn't signed up to be put on trial. Sarah Haynes jumped in, trying desperately to moderate, suggesting that maybe both of them had valid points and perhaps they could find common ground. But Travolta was already moving away from the desk. He said he appreciated Sarah's attempt at diplomacy, but there was no common ground to be found when one person came prepared for a conversation and the other came prepared for a takedown. Joy threw her hands up and said that if asking about publicly documented controversies constituted a takedown, then maybe the problem wasn't the questions but his unwillingness to address them honestly. Travolta stopped at the edge of the stage area. He turned back and said something that made even the camera operators shift nervously. He told Joy that for someone who built a career on questioning authority and challenging powerful institutions, she'd become exactly what she claimed to oppose. Someone who used their power to intimidate and silence people who didn't conform to her worldview. He said it was disappointing to see, but not surprising, because that's what happens when righteousness turns into self-righteousness. Joy's face flushed red, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless, which anyone who watches The View knows is an extremely rare occurrence. When she found her voice again, it came out sharp and controlled in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than yelling. She said that she'd spent decades fighting for marginalized communities and giving voice to people who couldn't speak for themselves, and she wasn't going to take lectures on righteousness from someone who'd remained silent while others suffered. She said his silence on certain issues was deafening, and that his refusal to engage with legitimate criticism showed exactly where his priorities lay. Travolta walked back toward the table, but not to sit down. He leaned against it and crossed his arms, his body language reading as someone who'd made a decision to stop being polite. He said Joy's problem was that she confused speaking loudly with speaking truth, and that she'd built such a fortress around her opinions that she couldn't recognize when she was wrong. He pointed out that she'd made numerous statements over the years that she'd later had to walk back or apologize for, yet she never extended that same grace to others. He said hypocrisy wrapped in activism was still hypocrisy. The other hosts were now visibly uncomfortable. Whoopi Goldberg, who'd been relatively quiet up to this point, finally spoke up. She said that things were getting heated and maybe everyone needed to take a step back. She suggested they cut to commercial and regroup. But Joy immediately cut her off, saying no, they weren't cutting to anything, because she wasn't going to let a guest come onto their show and make baseless accusations without backing them up. She turned to Travolta and demanded he specify exactly which statements she should have apologized for, exactly which positions she'd gotten wrong. Travolta smiled, but it wasn't friendly. He said he could start with her comments about various religious groups over the years, the way she'd painted entire communities with the same brush based on the actions of individuals, the casual mockery she'd engaged in that would have ended anyone else's career if they'd targeted different groups. He said she'd built her brand on being the person who could say anything, push any boundary, but the moment someone pushed back, she played victim. He said it was a masterclass in manipulation. Joy slammed her hand on the table, actually making the coffee mugs jump. She said she'd never played victim a day in her life, that everything she'd said came from a place of trying to protect people from harmful ideologies and dangerous practices. She said if he was comparing her criticism of institutions to actual harm those institutions had caused, then his moral compass was completely broken. She said maybe that was the real story. Not her questions, but his complete inability to distinguish between criticism and persecution. Travolta's voice dropped lower, which somehow made his words hit harder. He said the real story was watching someone who claimed to champion free thought, trying to destroy anyone who thought differently than her. He said Joy had become a gatekeeper of acceptable opinion, and that her self-appointed role as moral arbiter was exhausting to watch and dangerous to defend. He said the scariest zealots are always the ones who believe their zealotry is justified. The audience was making noise now, some gasps, some murmurs, a few scattered reactions that suggested people were taking sides. Alyssa Farah Griffin attempted to redirect, saying that clearly both of them cared deeply about important issues and maybe they were actually closer in their values than this argument suggested. Travolta turned to her and said, respectfully, that he appreciated her optimism, but some disagreements couldn't be papered over with false equivalencies. He said Joy had crossed a line from interviewing to attacking, and he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise for the sake of television civility. Joy laughed, but it was harsh and cutting. She said he wanted to talk about crossing lines. Let's talk about the lines crossed by organizations he supported, the families torn apart, the lives damaged, the truth suppressed. She said his discomfort with her questions paled in comparison to real suffering, and if he couldn't see that, then he was either willfully blind or complicit. She said she'd asked him direct questions, and he'd given her everything except direct answers, which told her everything she needed to know. Travolta's composure finally cracked slightly. His voice rose as he said he'd given her the only answer she deserved, which was that his personal beliefs were none of her business unless they hurt someone, which they hadn't. He said she was conflating his private choices with public actions, and that distinction mattered. He said Joy had decided he was guilty before he ever walked onto the stage, and nothing he could say would change her mind because she wasn't interested in conversation, she was interested in confirmation. Joy stepped out from behind the table entirely now, closing the distance between them. She said she'd decided nothing, that she'd simply asked questions any reasonable journalist would ask given the public record. She said if those questions made him uncomfortable, maybe he should examine why instead of attacking her for asking them. She said powerful people always cried persecution when they faced the tiniest bit of accountability, and it was textbook deflection. She said she'd been doing this job long enough to recognize a dodge when she saw one. Travolta matched her movement, and now they were standing almost face to face in the middle of the stage. He said the only thing textbook about this situation was her approach: ambush the guest, ask inflammatory questions, then act offended when they don't cooperate with their own character assassination. He said she'd perfected the art of the unfair fight, where she controlled the platform, the narrative, and the edit. He said the only reason he was still standing there was to make sure the audience saw exactly what kind of interview tactics she employed. One of the producers appeared at the edge of the stage, clearly trying to signal something to the hosts. Whoopi noticed and said they really did need to take a break. Joy ignored her completely. She told Travolta that if he thought her questions were unfair, he should try living through what people associated with his organizations had lived through. She said she'd interviewed countless individuals who'd shared stories of manipulation, control, and abuse, and his comfort didn't rank on her list of concerns. She said maybe that made her a bad host by his standards, but it made her a good journalist by hers. Travolta's eyes narrowed. He said Joy's mistake was thinking those two things were separate, that you could be a bad host, but a good journalist. He said journalism required fairness, context, and the presumption that your subject deserves basic respect. He said what she practiced was advocacy, masquerading as journalism, and while advocacy had its place, it shouldn't be disguised as something else. He said she'd become so convinced of her own righteousness that she couldn't see how her methods undermined her message. Joy's voice went quiet in a way that made everyone lean in. She said she'd been in this business for decades and had interviewed hundreds of people, and she knew the difference between someone with legitimate grievances and someone trying to avoid accountability. She said Travolta's entire performance, and she emphasized that word, was designed to make her look like the aggressor so he could avoid addressing substance. She said it was sophisticated misdirection, but it was still misdirection. She said the audience wasn't stupid. They could see what he was doing. Travolta looked out at the audience then, breaking the fourth wall in a way that felt deliberate and powerful. He said he trusted the audience to see exactly what was happening, which was a host who'd lost control of an interview and was now trying to regain it by making increasingly personal attacks. He said everyone watching could judge for themselves whether asking about someone's film and then immediately pivoting to religious interrogation constituted fair journalism. He said Joy was betting that people's pre-existing opinions about him would cloud their judgment about her tactics, and maybe she was right, but he wasn't going to make it easy for her. The tension in the studio had reached a point where it felt like something had to break. Security personnel had moved closer to the stage, though nobody had actually called for them. The other hosts were frozen, clearly out of their depth in a confrontation that had escalated beyond anything their typical mediation strategies could handle. Joy and Travolta stood there, neither willing to back down, both breathing hard from the intensity of the exchange. Joy broke the stalemate by doing something completely unexpected. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a dismissive one, but something that sounded almost genuine. She said that Travolta was good. She'd give him that. He'd managed to flip the entire conversation away from his controversies and onto her methods, which was exactly what a skilled performer would do. She said she respected the craft, even if she didn't respect the evasion. She told him that he could dress it up however he wanted, call it unfair journalism or personal attacks or whatever label made him feel better, but at the end of the day, he'd still refuse to answer a single substantive question about his associations. Travolta didn't laugh back. He said there was nothing to respect about pretending to offer someone a platform and then using it as an ambush point. He said Joy kept framing this as him evading questions, but the real issue was her asking questions that had no good answers by design. He said when you ask someone if they've stopped hurting people, you've already implied they were hurting people to begin with, and any answer becomes problematic. He said that wasn't interviewing, it was entrapment, and he'd watched her do it to dozens of guests over the years. He said the difference today was that he wasn't going to smile and play along. Joy's expression hardened again. She said entrapment was an interesting word choice from someone who'd spent years defending an organization that literally specialized in that exact practice. She said his projection was showing, and it wasn't a good look. She said she'd ask straightforward questions about his public associations and public statements, nothing more and nothing less. She said if those questions felt like traps to him, maybe that said more about his positions than her questions. She said innocent people don't typically react to basic inquiries like they're under attack unless they have something to hide. Travolta stepped even closer, close enough that the camera operators had to adjust their framing. He said Joy's logic was the same logic used by every authoritarian regime in history. If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. Submit to questioning or prove your guilt through resistance. He said that framework was designed to eliminate the possibility of privacy, dignity, or boundaries. He said just because someone was famous didn't mean they surrendered every right to personal autonomy. He said Joy had built a career on defending civil liberties, but apparently those liberties didn't extend to people she'd decided were acceptable targets. Joy actually smiled at that, but it was the kind of smile that made the temperature in the room drop. She said civil liberties didn't include the liberty to support organizations that violated other people's civil liberties, and if he couldn't grasp that distinction, then this conversation was pointless. She said his entire argument rested on the idea that his privacy mattered more than other people's safety, and she fundamentally rejected that calculus. She said public figures accepted certain trade-offs when they chose fame and fortune, and one of those trade-offs was facing questions about how they used their influence. Travolta's voice took on an edge that hadn't been there before. He said Joy had just revealed her entire philosophy in one sentence, that certain people deserved privacy and protection, while others deserved interrogation and exposure, with her as the arbiter of who fell into which category. He said that kind of selective application of principles wasn't principle at all. It was prejudice, dressed up in progressive language. He said she'd decided what he believed, who he was, and what he deserved before he'd ever sat down. And everything since had been theater designed to confirm her preconceptions. Joy threw her hands up in exasperation. She said he was exhausting, that arguing with him was like arguing with someone who refused to acknowledge that words had meanings and actions had consequences. She said she'd covered enough politicians and spin doctors to recognize semantic games when she saw them. She said Travolta was treating this like a debate to be won rather than questions to be answered, which proved her entire point about his unwillingness to engage in good faith. She said most guests could handle tough questions without melting down, but apparently Hollywood legends were more fragile than they appeared. That word, fragile, seemed to hit something deep. Travolta's whole demeanor shifted. He said quietly that he'd survived things Joy couldn't imagine, losses and betrayals and public humiliations that would have broken most people, so her attempt to paint him as fragile was laughable. He said what she was witnessing wasn't fragility, it was boundaries, something she clearly had no concept of. He said he'd come onto her show in good faith expecting a professional interview, and what he'd gotten was a prosecutorial attack designed to generate viral clips at his expense. He said if standing up to that made him difficult, then he'd wear that label proudly. Joy said good faith was rich, coming from someone representing institutions that specialized in bad faith manipulation. She said his personal tragedies, and she acknowledged he'd faced real loss, didn't insulate him from legitimate questions about his choices. She said plenty of people suffered without joining controversial organizations, and his pain didn't justify his associations. She said she actually felt sorry for him because he seemed genuinely unable to separate criticism of his choices from attacks on his character, which suggested those choices had become his character in ways he couldn't admit. Travolta looked at her with something that might have been pity. He said Joy's problem was that she'd convinced herself that cruelty in service of her causes wasn't cruelty at all, it was courage. He said she'd surrounded herself with people who affirmed that worldview until she'd lost the ability to hear dissent without interpreting it as moral failure. He said watching her work was like watching someone slowly disappear into their own certainty, and it was genuinely sad, because there'd probably been a time when she actually listened to people instead of just waiting for them to confirm what she already believed. Joy's face flushed again, darker this time. She said he didn't know anything about her work, about the thousands of conversations she'd had over decades of broadcasting. She said his armchair psychology was amateur at best and insulting at worst. She said maybe in his world everyone who disagreed with him was close-minded or biased or broken. But in reality, sometimes people disagreed because they'd done their homework and reached different conclusions. She said she'd researched his background, his associations, his public statements, and her questions flowed from that research, not from personal animosity. Travolta asked her point blank if she'd done similar research on every guest or just the ones she'd prejudged as problematic. He said he'd watched her interview people with far more controversial backgrounds than his, people who'd done documentably harmful things, and she'd been nothing but warm and accommodating. He said her selective outrage revealed what this was really about, which wasn't protecting anyone, but rather punishing people whose beliefs she found personally offensive. He said at least other critics were honest about their biases. But Joy wrapped hers in pretensions of journalistic duty. Joy said she didn't need lectures on journalistic duty from an actor, regardless of how acclaimed his performances were. She said she'd been doing investigative work and advocacy journalism since before he was famous, and she'd earned the right to ask tough questions without being second-guessed by her subjects. She said if he couldn't handle the heat, he should have stayed in Hollywood, where interviewers treated celebrities like royalty instead of citizens. She said daytime television had standards, and one of those standards was not letting powerful people control the narrative just because they were uncomfortable. Travolta said the only person trying to control the narrative was Joy, who'd structured this entire segment as a trap from the beginning. He said her questions weren't designed to elicit information but to create conflict, which was why she kept pushing even after he'd made his boundaries clear. He said a real journalist would have respected those boundaries and found other angles to explore. But Joy wasn't interested in journalism. She was interested in combat. He said she'd found someone willing to fight back, and now she didn't know what to do with it. The producer appeared again, this time more insistent, clearly mouthing something to Whoopi about wrapping up. Whoopi stood and said firmly that they needed to end this segment now. Joy immediately protested, saying they weren't finished. Whoopi said yes, they absolutely were finished. This had gone far beyond a normal interview and needed to stop. Joy turned to her and said she didn't need to be protected from difficult conversations. Whoopi replied that this wasn't about protection. It was about the show maintaining some semblance of professionalism. So there you have it, one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below telling us this. Do you think Joy Behar crossed the line with her questioning? Or was John Travolta being overly defensive about legitimate concerns? Let us know where you stand.